I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on the variety of INTPs. Now, this was not something that I could truncate into the on INTP TPs video. But something that's funny about INTPs is that there's a great deal of variety in terms of INTPs as individuals, and I would like to explain a bit of why that's the case. Fundamentally, from a genetic standpoint, is that there are variants even still in general clusters of factors. So it's the case that if you wanted to say the INTP, model the INTP based off of a cluster of traits, it's the case that those traits would probably be facets of any one trait. So it's the case that if we were looking at an INTP from just the Big Five standpoint, you will find INTPs that there's 6 facets to every item in the Big Five, and I'm not going to list all 6 facets of the 5 traits, but it is the case that you do have it such that an INTP is going to differ. The INTP is going to probably be predominant in a few factors which characterizes them as INTPs, like say for openness, they probably test strongly in 3 facets that made them an INTP. Any other facet that they tend to have a strong leaning towards is basically genetic randomness. And so it's like this for all types, but it's really funny for INTPs to me because you can find different types of INTPs. And I don't mean different types of INTPs like I believe in sub-personality types or anything like that. I think you just have a bell-shaped distribution, and it does a thing. And when you want to look at maybe a cognitive function, taking it from the trait landscape, taking it to the cognitive function landscape, you're going to find that, like, say you map out introverted thinking, you're going to find those who are higher and lower on the distribution of that trait. Though all of them have introverted thinking to a stronger degree than anybody else in the average population. So it's still high. It's like if you would take the average population and you cut off a subsection of it, and then took that subsection and made your own, made another curved distribution of it, you're going to find that there is variance on that distribution. It's the case that as you look at the tail end of that variance, I believe there you will find a connection with other general factors like IQ. But it's the case that, introverted thinking, IQ, I'm not going to get into that, but that's the working model I have for this appraisal. But it's the case that because it's like that, or at least because I only say it's like that because of what I observe from other people, it's the case that INTPs can be far less iconoclastic than people take them to be, or people make them out to be. It's the case that they're much more Prufrock in their nature, like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. They're participating in all of the conventional social norms, idioms, and wisdoms. They're just a bit disillusioned with them, and they're a bit awkward, I guess is the best way to describe it. And they have some idiosyncratic tendencies that they keep under wraps, or they live in a rather strange or bohemian way, but the way in which they present themselves out in the world and the goals that they choose to pursue are just like the goals of every other person. Most people go to college, and it's the case that I think a lot of INTPs don't go to college, but a lot of INTPs do go to college because it's an item of conventional wisdom at this point in time that one should go to school to get better opportunities for themselves. Though that's not that again is not accurate. Like, you don't necessarily need to go to school. I don't think everybody needs to go to university to be, or college to be highly successful. In fact, I think that's probably a really bad idea that we have floating right now. But it's the case that, and for multiple reasons, but it's the case that, like, even non-economic ones, whatever, I'm going to make a different video about that, but it's just the case that, though that's the case, and you find INTPs participating in things and things like that, then you have the, how should I say, more, bourgeoisie INTPs. Some of this is based off of temperamental variances, and some of this is also based off of behavioral variances, and this is why you can't conflate behavior with temperament. Like, they're not the same things. And it's the case that you get some temperamental variances and some behavioral variances that are given, that I guess you could draw the etymology for them based on their landscape and their upbringing. But you have the bourgeoisie INTPs, and they're very much about aesthetics, and they're very much about their own taste, and the difference between them and other people. They're not necessarily in step and in line with all the tracks of society per se, but they're just as much, they're just a part of and track and step with a very normative European mindset of the upper class, I guess. That's like a type of INTP you have. Then you have the, and all INTPs are fundamentally concerned with knowledge, don't get me wrong, like they all think and they're all interested in knowledge, but not all of them are the epistemological pioneers. Like, not all of them are like that. There's a reason why, because that's a very expensive way of being. And there's other factors that lead to whether or not you're going to be an epistemological pioneer. Now, all INTPs care about, all INTPs, don't get me wrong, they invent knowledge structures, but it's the case that maybe they don't all invent theories that are going to change the world. I mean, and it's the case that you'll have it such that INTPs are far more original in their thoughts, and they're far more prone to making sense of the world in their own way, but not all of them are epistemological pioneers. Like, they're really not. It's also why a lot of times the descriptions you read about, like, Einstein is an INTP, most likely, but he's not a description of INTPs. Like, he's really not. Though a lot of people like to use him. Like, that's a really bad, it's a poor analyses or representation, because there's some things that Einstein does that is generally like an INTP, and there are other things that Einstein does, or the ways that in which he was, that was just Einstein. And you have the hermetic INTP, because INTPs are very much mediated also by the dopaminergic networks. I mean, like, you know, one thing's that's funny about an INTP in general is that they're, you know, INTPs are actually more prone to addictive and compulsory behaviors than people might first realize. And, like, any INTPs that's listening to this is like, no fucking duh. But it's the case that, and I mean, like, anybody who's related to them might also realize this too. I don't know, or like is in a relationship with one. But it's the case that they very much so are that way. Like, they very much so are that way. At least they can be. And it's because they're part of their I guess motivational scheme is mediated by the dopaminergic reward network, and that's why they're so damn exploratory, or they're at least willing to be exploratory about ideas and things in the world, and they're not really interested in harming themselves for the most part. Like, you know, an INTP might want to prove something to themselves, so they do something that's very extreme, like in terms of, let's go skydiving or jump off a building or something, just to see what would happen. But they're not like they're not really keen on doing things like that. Typically, they're not. Like, INTPs are very self-preserving and look to avoid the problematic factors of life, like, to no degree. Like, if you ever want a friend that will tell you if something's going to go wrong, like, there's a reason why INTPs exist to this day, even though they're a very small part of the population. It's because they can preserve themselves. Like, Galileo is a great example of this. Like, Galileo was put on house arrest for his whole life. They were first thinking about hanging Galileo. They were really thinking about hanging him. They really wanted to kill him. Like, the Vatican definitely wanted to kill Galileo, but Galileo didn't get killed. Not like Joan of Arc, like, because like because there's a real tendency in an INTP to be self-preserving in a different way. That's not based off of they're not like the INTP, which they attribute the veracity of their morals and their principles and values to themselves, like their maintenance and adherence to those things as the items of their selves. But in the sense that I am perishable, that's how the INTP tries to preserve themselves. And that's also why Nietzsche did not like them very much, because he saw them as, like all INTP philosophers, you hear him talk about, like Schopenhauer and Wagner. He did not like them very much, even though they very much influenced him in their thinking. It's the case that he didn't like them as people very much. He saw them as pathetic, and there's a reason. There's a reason for that, because INTPs are self-preserving. The only reason I bring that up is because that's also why you have the Hermetic INTP, but it's because they're prone to being embedded in context, and so they find context the most meaningful thing for them to exist in. Like, all human beings are like that to a certain degree, but they tend to be more like that, much more like an ESFJ would be or an ISFJ would be, but not in the ways that not completely in the ways in which they would be that way. But it's because they tend to be more organized on average, or more conscientious on average, I think, that they're like that. And the way that thing plays itself out is that they tend to get into routines, and they tend to be very dependent on these routines. And I mean, like, it's funny, like, to the degree at which an INTP can become dependent on a routine, or just act out a routine just because it's familiar and it's simple. Like, I mean, like, no thought put to it whatsoever. Like, and they can do that. And there's INTPs that are like that, very much so. I've met them, and at least I've met them, and a lot of them are in college. Like, a lot of them are in college, and it's the case that you can also have the humanistic anarchist INTP. Like, it's the case that they think chaos would be good for other people. Like, that's really what they think. I mean, like, I do know why they think that way, but it's the case that some INTPs are more humanly based in their sentiments. Like, some INTPs are very much so strongly humanistic in their sentiments. Like, they really, really like people. Like, there's a lot of INTPs that don't like people, don't get me wrong. Alright, there's INTPs that are indifferent about people, but need them, and then there's INTPs that don't like people, but need them, and so they have their relationship with people. But there's INTPs that like people. There really are. I've met them. Like, and it's the case that who's a good example of this? AC Grayling. AC Grayling is a great example of INTP that likes people and likes the attention he receives from people. Mark Zuckerberg is another great example. Though what you want to think about his moral character, when I say like people, I just mean that they're far more amicable and yielding in their nature towards the interests, ideas, thoughts, and motivation of other people. Like that's like there are INTPs that are more agreeable than other INTPs. That's definitely the case, and that's not just women. Like trust me, I met one. Like that's not just female INTPs, but they can be very. I should say they can be a bit more agreeable than one would think, and it's the case that you also have INTPs that are and. Because they're agreeable, and also because they're more open, they tend to think that if you got rid of certain bureaucracies and you got rid of certain rules, traditions, tendencies, and behaviors in people, we could live in a anarchistic state, and we'd be perfectly fine. I was like that when I was younger, but I don't believe that now. Like, I really don't believe that now. I know too much about human nature now to believe that. But they would be, those are the INTPs that tell you they're either libertarians or they're capital anarchists. Those are also those types of INTPs. What's another type of INTP? And then I want to say something, like, just because somebody has autism does not mean they're an INTP. Like, that's also another thing that bothers me. It's the case that INTPs don't... Like, INTPs are not autistic. I don't know where that, the stereotype came from. People might accuse them of being autistic, but that's because people are obtuse. Like, it's not because that's how they actually act in the world. INTPs can be very animated. They can be problematically animated, in fact, and it's the case that they're not, because they're not very aware. Like, they're very poor in self-awareness, and they can be very poor in self-awareness, and they can be very poor in, social dynamics. I mean, just to be frank. And so, but that's far from being autistic. Like, I don't know where any person came up with that. Because if you're autistic, you're not necessarily interested in other people. I mean, it depends on the severity of the autism, and it's also the case that autistic people have drives just like anybody else. So they want to have sex, and they want relationships, and they want to do everything like another person can. I mean, and they'll get crushes and things on people. They'll act out the drives, but in terms of what you would think is typical of human behavior, you won't find that from an autistic person. But you will find what's typical of human behavior from an INTP. It's the case, like, because I've dated an INTP girl as an INTP. I'm not saying that that's the worst idea ever, but I'm just saying, like, my experience was not that great, and it's because, whatever. But it's the case that an INTP woman acts just like another woman does. Like, don't overestimate the difference in them. An INTP male acts like another male would act, like, to a certain degree. Like, it's like there's not that great of a difference. Like, there's not something so fundamentally different with the humanly qualities of an INTP versus another human being. Like, there really isn't. I don't know where that myth comes from. Like, I really don't. Like, if you even look at Einstein, that fool got around. Like, he had a lot of sex. Like, he had a lot of sex. He wasn't a very, like, he had a lot of sex. He managed to accumulate a lot of wealth, but then he blew it all. Like, you know, that's also an issue. But in the end of his life, he was very well taken care of. He wasn't worrying about eating, though he didn't eat very often, but that was because of his nature rather than his inability to gather funds or money or anything like that. The dude was fairly well off, and he liked his status and his prestige within the physics community to a very strong extent. It was very much a motivating factor for him. Same thing about Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was a man that had to live in the center of social events. And Oppenheimer was very much an INTP, at least from what I can tell from reading his biography. But it's the case, and they both got freaking down with the ladies. They liked sex, like they really did. And they weren't very shy about that fact. They didn't necessarily... Well, they weren't like very promoting about that fact, but it's the case that they're human. They're all too human. Like, they're very much human. and I don't know where people get that idea or that notion. Like, what's another type of INTP that can exist? And then there is a distinction, like, in terms of even what their talents might lie in. Because, and this has to do with general intelligence, and the point I'd like to make here is that most people, even if they're gifted, are typically gifted either at the verbal items of the G factor or the non-verbal items of the G factor. But it's very rare that a person is exceptional in both, or items that come from both categories. And it's the case that you find that with INTPs very often. Like, some have more verbal fluency and verbal talents than others, and some have more spatial and numerical fluency than others, and fluid intelligence. Like, fluid intelligence is very much a factor of nonverbal IQ. And it's the case that you'll know that when you speak to them, and it's also the case that those things will be the sole determiner of what ideas that they tend to come up with. Because there's some INTPs that like to come up with play on words, and they're very interested in, like, symbolic logic, or like the semantics of and syntax, like from a I guess from a traditional logical standpoint when you're dealing with syllogisms and things like that. And they're not very interested in mathematics or anything like that. They don't really care about that stuff. But then you have INTPs that, and they're also not very interested in science either. Like, they're not. Then you have INTPs that are more visually spatially based, and it's the case that they tend to be interested in mathematics and they tend to be interested in science for the most part. And I think that this also has something to do with the bifurcation of openness to experience as a trait. Openness to experience as a trait, period, has greater correlation with verbal intelligence versus nonverbal intelligence, but the small correlation it has with nonverbal intelligence only comes from the facet of ideation or intellect. And so some people are more open towards ideas and interested in ideas, but words are ideas too. So I mean, like, I guess in the way you want to put this, some people are the way I should put this, some people are more interested in things, and some people are more interested in the ideas that permeate around the humanities or humanistic sentiments and things like that. If you're asking me how I fall, like, in general, I'm more towards things, but I have an interest in the humanities and things as well. But I would never, like, you couldn't pay me to major in those things. Because I don't like the way that they're taught, for the most part, and several other reasons. And at the end of the day, I don't necessarily care about all that's there in the humanities either. And I really only care to read things for their ideas. Like, I mean, like, that's why I won't just read anything, because not all things have interesting ideas in them. Yeah. And I don't like just fantasy. Like, fantasy is only nice. Fantasy is only nice when there's some nice ideas embedded in that fantasy. Like, you can see sort of the arguments that are being made in terms of their relevance to either something we haven't considered before, something about human existence, something. It has to be something, but I don't just like pure whimsy. That's stupid to me. I don't like that. And I don't like just pure romance. Like, I can't, I fucking hate that stuff. Like, I can't, sorry. Anyways, like, it's just a case that, yes, so there's different predilections in terms of the knowledge structures that they even bother to come up with and what they may be prone to pay attention to. That doesn't have anything to necessarily to do with their temperamental variances. Yeah, and there's more variances that you could stack on, because there's a whole host of superordinate traits that any one person can come into the world as. I don't really know if you can have a highly sensitive INTP. I really doubt that, because I think for the most part, though I've heard somebody say that they are, I really doubt that. And there's a reason why I doubt that, because I think for the most part, if you're going to have the temperament in the first place, you have to be skewed to a certain set of neurochemical variances that don't make themselves present. Like, they're antagonistic. Like, you won't have it, you can't have the entire cake. Like, you really can't. Because certain chemicals are antagonistic to one another, and while certain chemicals are antagonistic and certain chemicals are agonistic, and meaning they cooperate with one another. And testosterone and dopamine and norepinephrine are all ones that work like that. But estrogen, progesterone, and oxytocin are also like that. And that's why you see these diverging mediums in terms of people's temperamental variances, because some people might be progesterone, estrogen, and oxytocinly based in terms of the shaping of their neural phrenology, and secondarily be made up by either like serotonin, like the serotonergic and adrenergic neurochemicals. And you get variation like that in temperament, but I think like the fundamental, at least when you're looking at the schisms between thinking and feeling, like it's progesterone, oxytocin, and estrogen that make for the tendency. And this is like, and that's not a, and I know there's NFs as men, and I know there's SFs as men, and that's not a pejorative, because there's a real thing about oxytocin, estrogen, and progesterone. They incite, especially estrogen and progesterone. They incite neurogenerativity more often, and so that's why women tend to have greater connectivity amongst their brain and overall, like on average, versus men, because men still have a healthy amount of testosterone in comparison to the amount of progesterone, estrogen, and oxytocin that they have in them. But it's the case, like, on average, that's why women's brains are more betterly connected than not. But then you have, it's the case that, whatever, I can't make like a complete description of why brains turn out to be the way that they are and completely map it onto personality as we understand it now, and it'd be completely accurate, so I'm not going to bother with it. But it's just a case that a very good bit of information to know is that you most likely, from what we can tell now, cannot have a highly sensitive INTP. But I think that's about the only personality, superordinate, like, personality factors that you can't have with INTPs. Because some INTPs aren't creative. Like, I mean, like, that's true. Like, alright, so what I mean by creative is that if you gave them a creative achievement questionnaire, or you gave them a different creative battery test, and sum those scores together and average them and put them on a distribution, you would not find everybody being above average in terms of their distribution of the trait of creativity. And it's the case that most INTPs are average, and some really aren't all that creative, and they're below average in terms of their levels of creativity. But that's fine, like, it's the case, but they're more iconoclastic. Because being iconoclastic does not mean you're creative, it means you're crazy. Like, if you want me to be frank, like, because creativity is not just, because creativity is multifaceted. So it's the case that, but all INTPs are much more idiosyncratic, and idiosyncratic can lead to iconoclasm. And if you're more iconoclastic than not, then you might be more creative than not. But there are some INTPs that are very creative, and there's some that aren't. And this is a thing with most people. But it's only, but I mean, like, you really would not find that, well, hell, I can't say that, but anyways, it's just a case that there's variance. There's a lot of bloody freaking variance in the type. That's why I deal with motivation and phenomenology, because if you want to talk about behavior, man, like, you just won't cover it. You really won't cover it. And when you're trying to make a general description, use multiple people. Don't use one person. Like, that's not a good idea. Like, that's really not a good idea. And don't use just those people that are like that one person that you already have in mind. Like, it's the case that there is a average INTP. Like, if you summed all the INTPs together, you get like an average INTP. but it's the case that most people are not a representation of that average. And it's why I say that and why I said in other videos that I think, in terms of self-actualization, your temperament is most likely your highest or ideal self, or the actualized self, because it's an aggregate. It's not a real thing. It's like it's an ideal. But you, as the individual, are not that thing. Like, you're not your personality. Like, whether or not you realize that or not, or whether or not you think that or not, that's the case. Because it's very general, and you probably don't fit those dimensions. I mean, some people get closer than others, but it's the case that most people, like even the people that get closer to it than not, they're not very much like those ideals. Like, they're really not. And it's the case that, yeah, well, that's just my video on the variances in INTPs, and hopefully you found it interesting. And it's not really about the different types, but just the fact that there can be different types, I guess, is why I decided to make it. It's not really different types, because it's not a type thing. Like, it's not a subclass thing. It's a diversity thing. Like, it's like all zebras have stripes, but not all their stripes are the same. It's basically the way I could put it. But yeah, so that's my video on the variation of INTPs. Thank you for watching.